Hey guys, welcome to my Fur Friday, and today we're on number 8 and we're not actually doing fur, we are doing feathers. So I may have the name of the breed wrong, so if you do know the name of this bird, pop in the comments below, but I can't remember unfortunately, and it was a while ago I took this photo. So it's a much longer video, so the process is actually sped up a little bit more. I think this took me well over an hour in total to do. And I think because I was working through the colours to try and work in my head what I thought was going to be the best to work, it's a case of I add the pencil names as I work through it rather than have them at the beginning. Most of the tutorials I get to grips pretty quickly with the colours that I want, but I wasn't 100% sure on here quite how I was going to do it because I've zoomed into quite a small area. It's quite out of focus, so I wanted to make this a little bit more high res than the reference picture. So I will go through the photos with you as I will go through the pencils with you as and when they pop up on the screen, and we'll discuss it in more details, the method that I used. But essentially, as with all my fur tutorials, I have blocked in the main colour areas. That's the advantage actually of working on this size, is that you can block in larger areas, but it also teaches you when you move on to a larger portrait that actually working in sections is much better than trying to work on one massive area at once. Now, if memory serves me right, we used the burnt ochre, we used the dark sepia, we used some warm greys, I used the ivory, and all I did at the back was just shove some green down just to fill the space. Essentially, I wasn't trying to be correct at all, as you can tell by the colour. I just grabbed whatever green I had near me, so just to fill that corner up, really, just so it wasn't empty. So yeah, I've blocked all the areas out, and again I've left all the highlights, all the tips of the feathers which have that sort of creamy ivory feel to it. I have left those specifically empty so we can work on negative space. I wasn't far off. Okay, so we've used nougat, dark sepia, burnt ochre and ivory, and I put there bird of prey because I couldn't actually remember, and I have tried doing one of those Google reverse searches and it keeps coming up with hawk eagle, so I have no idea if that's correct. I don't know, we'll find out. Someone will know and someone will tell me, I'm sure. So the bit nearing essentially what is the patch near his eye is pretty blurred and there's not a huge amount of detail in there, so I've tried to stick to that this time round without adding too much detail in it. It does take a while to render up, so you know, please bear with me to the end of the video because they are worth seeing at the end. You'll see on a lot of the tutorials that for the first sort of 3/4 of the tutorial you're thinking that just looks a mess, and there are a lot of ugly stages when it comes to doing these patches of fur and portraits in general. So yeah, it's worth sticking with me to the end. They're only on average about 15 minutes long, and then they're worth it. I think you do gain a bit of insight, so yeah, stick with me. So I did use the method of blocking, blending, blocking, blending, and the main reason being is there wasn't a huge amount of information to get down with regards to feather detail. Unlike some of the other birds that we'll be looking at in the future, I'll be doing iridescent feathers and all sorts of things, so it's worth hitting that subscribe button and popping the notifications to all, because there'll be a video coming out every Friday. Yeah, so I pretty much just blocked in colours. There was no strokes in directions of feathers or anything like that. You'll see much later on there's a little bit that I do on the very tips of the feathers just to give it a little bit more structure, and you can see it in the little snippet of the reference photo. But I was being fussy because at the end of the day, depending on the scale that you draw these things at, this is pretty much how you would approach it. Feathers can be really tricky depending on where they are. I have found them quite a tough task in the past. But the trick is, as I've mentioned many times before, don't get stuck on the fact that you're having to draw a feather. Worry more about where your shadows are going to sit, because it's those shadows that form the shape of your feather. Where feathers overlap consistently, you need shadow underneath each one to give you the illusion of depth. And with feathers, you can get them laying quite flat, and if that's the case, you find that you get a few details through the actual feather itself where you can see sort of little lines that go up. And you know, I really must know the anatomy of a feather because it would make this so much easier. But when you've got quite prominent feather shapes like we have on this particular subject. Okay, sorry, just to let you know, I've changed the camera angle purely because my hand was covering up too much of the image and you were losing what I was doing. So as I was saying, they're very prominent, the feathers, and there's a real distinct between the highlight of his tip of the feather and the feather that sits underneath, and that's where you do need a definition of a real good, not necessarily shadow, but the colour of the feather underneath. And that is what's going to give you the 3D look that the back of his head has. As I say, some feathers lay quite flat, so you would reduce the amount of shadow that you have under there. Some places have none at all. It's just a case of really observing your reference photo. I say it a lot: observe, observe, observe. Observe? I don't say that. Observe. That way you are ensuring that what you put down is in the correct areas. As I say, the best way to do it is just to break your subject down and don't look at it as a beak, as an eye, as a nose, as a feather. Just ignore all that and just look at that section and go, okay, there's quite a big chunk of shadow there, let's get that in. There's quite a prominent highlight there, let's make sure I leave that. Okay, we've got some red here, we've got some blue there. And then when you get all those elements together and you step back and you have a look, all of a sudden you have this drawing and it makes sense. Very quickly going on ugly stages, actually, there is quite a lot of those in drawings, and a few people are scared to show their work in progress because of these ugly stages. But I prefer to, because actually I think it gives people that are working towards your level or just having a go that actually no drawing is perfect until you get to the end. It's very rare that, I mean, the sections that you work on look amazing, but everything else can look very rough and ready, and that's absolutely normal. It's a perfectly normal, what's the word I'm looking for? It's a perfectly normal stage of drawing. It's very much a roller coaster. We go through this, oh, that looks amazing. Oh, it's really starting to look bad. Oh no, now that looks amazing again. Oh no, now it's looking crap. So just stick with it. So you can see here that I have just put those little lines in to just indicate some of the feather detail which were there on the back feathers, and where it starts to merge and soften towards the eye in further into the head, that's where it starts to soften and there is less detail on there, and I portray that as and when I get to working on that section of the bird. But you can see I'm really distinctly dividing those feathers up. I'm putting the shadows in where they need to be, I'm putting the bulk of the colour where it needs to be, and just working on each feather at a time. I may go from one to another, but it all is a case of blocking in those areas. I'm blending out with the ivory there, and I think it's important to blend it at this stage, and that's because it softens the edge of the colour area into the area that we left as a highlight. What this does is it gives you a natural smudging. Yes, I said that word, smudging. I've mentioned it in a previous video about people worrying about their portraits looking muddy. Sometimes portraits look muddy, sometimes animals look muddy, sometimes they're not perfect. So don't be too afraid, judge it by your portrait. So where I use the ivory to smudge the edges of the colour, it naturally pushes it into the highlight, which gives you a really smooth transitional blend, making it look much more natural. I'm starting to blend in now and smoothing out that area that I said was nearer the face that with the burnt ochre ochre and getting that colour in there, and I'm blending it out with the dark sepia and just getting as much of a transitional blend as I can. And I'm working again between the layers, and that way as I build up the shadow, build up the depth, I'm not sort of worrying too much about just having blocks and it's just blending a bit together. So as long as you keep your shadows defined to your highlights, you can't really go wrong. What happens is each time you build up colour on your actual feather itself, you realise either the one underneath needs brightening, or it needs darkening, or you need a patch more shadow underneath a certain area, which is why sometimes it's worth working on a nice section at a time, because sometimes you can't always tell whether or not you've gone dark enough or light enough until you work on the net bit next to it. So don't worry too much if you don't feel it's getting there. What you can then do is just work on the next bit that's beside it. Then once you start working up those values, you'll actually be able to see quite quickly where you need to make adjustments. I'm now just giving it a very light glaze of the burnt ochre over the whole top, because I didn't feel it had enough orange through the feathers. So I'm just using a very light layer and very light pressure, and just doing a very light glaze of the burnt ochre, and it really did help actually make that picture pop. That's pretty much it from me today. If you've got any questions, pop them in the comment section below, and I shall see you guys on the next video. Bye!